Cool. All right, we're recording as well. All right, welcome to episode number 1 of the Convictions Podcast. I'm Brandon Coluccio, your host and your guide on this journey as we talk to some incredible people and learn about their adventures through life, business, failure, and success. On this show, we discuss the topic of catastrophic failure because we realize that with failure comes pain, and with pain comes the opportunity to harvest wisdom. Our goal for this show is to inspire and humanize people who have overcome huge setbacks and use those lessons to launch themselves to heights that they never imagined possible. Remember that every failure is a golden opportunity to harness the chaos of your life and to propel yourself forward. All right, so let's dive in. I'm excited and grateful to share today's guest with each and every one of you. Today's guest is not only one of my friends, but I'm grateful and humbled to mention that his guidance and support have had a major positive influence on me when I was going through one of the most difficult times of my life. But our guest has also helped thousands of others through what is often the most traumatic experience of their lives as well. However, his life wasn't always as positive. While working as a young stockbroker at prestigious financial firms such as Merrill Lynch, Bear Stearns, and UBS, our guest began to involve himself with the wrong people and ultimately let his guard down, thus embroiling him in a financial Ponzi scheme that ultimately earned him an 18-month sentence in federal prison. But the reason I love his story is that he didn't allow failure to derail his future. Instead, he turned that failure into opportunity. Determined to improve himself and to help others in the process, fresh out of federal prison, our guest launched White Collar Advice in 2008 and has built it into what is now the nation's top white-collar criminal advisory firm. Our guest and his team help thousands of defendants and their families find support and direction in what are extremely challenging circumstances. Our guest is the author of 3 books, Lessons from Prison, Ethics in Motion, and Living Deliberately. He is also interviewed with Dr. Phil and is often featured on some of the nation's most prominent news outlets, such as Forbes, Fox, CNN, ABC, and many others. But most importantly, our guest and his firm, White Collar Advice, provide valuable content to men and women who are entangled in the prison system, teaching them how to reconcile their mistakes, learn new skills, and live as positive and productive members of society. Please, let's give a warm welcome to my friend, Justin Paperny.
Thank you for having me. Congratulations on the podcast.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, man. So, all right, so let's dive into it. Kind of my first thing I want to cover is, there's possible that many people haven't heard of you. Maybe you could kind of give a quick summary of your story, kind of highlighting some of the things that you've been through and kind of what you felt in the pit of those challenges that you faced in your life.
So I grew up in an environment where no one had really endured a great deal of struggle. I'm talking about real struggle, certainly some setbacks, I suppose, but nothing catastrophic. And in that environment, didn't know anyone that had been to prison. Maybe we heard about some civil lawsuits, but you don't think or hear of prison. Yeah. Had a lot of opportunity and privilege in life. I think it's essential for defendants or people going through struggle to recognize what they have, perhaps what they have not had. That helps find a sense of perspective. But in my case, I frequently say I'm not going to spend time talking too much about my upbringing because it was perfect. I had a lot of opportunity, yet despite opportunities and successes as a student athlete through USC, after graduating college, 6 years into my career, found myself making some bad decisions on behalf of a client. I knew right from wrong, yet knowing right from wrong didn't stop me from turning the other way for money when I learned that my client was facilitating a fraud. Once an investigation began, I didn't know how to respond to catastrophic struggle or setback or adversity. I'd never dealt with any adversity, even though I was 28 at the time. That's sort of embarrassing to acknowledge, but it's true. So I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to respond. And when I did figure out a response, it was lying and kind of living like an ostrich with my head buried. And those decisions, of course, only made matters worse. And as a result of just terrible choices for 3.5 years, including lying to my lawyers and the government, I found myself standing for count in federal prison for 18 months, wishing and just wondering how I got here, but begging for some sort of do-overs that don't exist. And once I finally got somewhat aware on the inside, I recognized I wasn't alone, that there are so many people that wish for a do-over, wish for another opportunity. And some stay mired in that pain of just never being able to move forward because they're so stuck in the past. With help of Michael Santos, my friend and business partner, someone you know quite well, with the help of Michael, I began to say, well, I want to go down this road, because if I don't, this 18 months is going to amount to a life sentence. And I'd already put people who loved me through enough. So with guidance and help and a lot of tutelage, good God, a lot of tutelage and hard work, I began to get on the right path. And I'm still trying to get on that path 13 years after my release from prison.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of that resonates with me as well. I'm kind of beginning that process myself now, and it's difficult. And so, back up a little bit, we'll kind of get to the prison story and the experience and all that stuff. But, as I look back through my own experience, it's almost as if you can see it happening now in retrospect, right? Like you can see what was going on, but in the moment you're sort of like, you're buried in it, right? You're too in it to see it. And so, at what point do you think that shift began to occur when you saw yourself, you're a young guy with a great career trajectory. At what point did you kind of notice, now having the opportunity to look back, that things were not going in the right direction? Was there a marker moment, or was it like a slippery slope?
Yes, it started very early in my career at Merrill Lynch, when I was a cold calling, cold walking, hustling stockbroker. And I just built my business through cold walking, primarily walking into people's offices, dealing with sort of the embarrassment of getting thrown out, people looking at you like, why is this nut job walking in to solicit us? And his, nice suit and Rolex I couldn't afford. But, you're taught, if you're going to ask someone who has $1 million for $1 million, look like you have it. So I think right out of college, I began to live a life I couldn't yet afford. I think a part of me wanted to get like in 2 years, where maybe it takes 5. And then I began to rationalize that I was working with people who put their own interests above anybody else's. And more specifically at Merrill, they wanted us to partner. In other words, they wanted me, the junior broker, new guy, to partner with the senior broker. And I didn't want to, because I saw so many of my friends who were junior brokers merge that book of business, flunk out of the business, and the senior broker would then usurp or take their book of business, because they didn't get fired, but you can't live on $1,500 a month as a young broker. So you go work at Charles Schwab all day and give stock quotes. So I began to feel like the wretchedness of this industry pretty quickly. And rather than kind of do my own thing, which I'd always done as a student athlete, and rather than do my own thing, I began to kind of sink to the lowest levels of the business and just sort of rationalize this is the way it works. So I had no loyalty to the brokerage firms. I had loyalty to my clients, to what I thought was in our best interest. But I just felt that I was working in a wretched industry, and I saw people rewarded based on how much they produce, not necessarily based on their conduct, and saw friends get fired and let go ostensibly for ethical violations, but it was really because they weren't producing. Yeah. So I saw it's kind of like the criminal justice system to a degree, 2 tiers, kind of like 2 systems of justice or treatment based on how much you produce or who you know. And that's when I began to change. About a year into my career, I was only 23, but I slowly and subtly began to make some bad decisions. So when I ultimately crossed the line, it wasn't like so out of the blue, like, oh my goodness, how could Justin have done this? Right. It was this cliched slippery slope we hear about. It was bad decisions over a period of years that allowed me to seize a really bad opportunity that sent my dumb ass to federal prison 3.5 years after I did it.
Wow. And so, at some point, you have to decide to take ownership of your life, right? And I think, just from my own personal experience, kind of having gone through this, it's easy to point the finger at other people or a circumstance or bad luck, right? There's always,
because it doesn't require any work. It's
correct.
Right.
And so at what point did you kind of make that decision, right? Or maybe it was an evolution, but to take complete ownership of the circumstances that had become your life?
So I was in federal prison for several months, and I adjusted to prison like so many prisoners do, which is a lot of exercise, some relaxation. This is what gets some people upset when they hear what life is like in a minimum security camp. Yeah. Despite COVID, which was a whole different dynamic with quarantines and things that were just brutal and almost inhumane. Yeah. Right. But you endured that. Generally speaking, I'm several months into my prison term, and I went in very overweight and out of shape. I put on about 40 pounds through my case. So I began to get fitter and stronger, but I was kind of having a fun time. And then I was in Michael Santos's cubicle one day, and I'm just arrogantly and foolishly saying, oh, I ran 10 miles today and I did 10 pull-ups, and I'm like showing off my new biceps. And he was kind of responded and said, hey, dude, how much are people going to pay you to do those pull-ups?
Right.
Are people going to pay you to run miles? And I'm like, I don't think anyone's going to pay me to do that. So he said, perhaps you can become more aware and look at the struggle that follows people that don't prepare for their inevitable release. He said, it's great that you're reading books. What did you learn from the last book that you read? Why did you read it? How did you come across it? How will it help you become a law-abiding citizen? How will it help you make your parents proud? Because I saw your mom visiting last week and she continues to cry in every visit. What are you doing to prepare for the inevitable obstacles that await you? And I'm like, wow, I just sort of exercise all day. I wasn't thinking about life on the other side. And then I began to notice a lot of my fellow prisoners like scared to go home. Imagine serving 2 years for a tax crime, and you don't want to go home because you've lost your license. You have to start over. You've destroyed your reputation. You haven't been preparing to build a new career. You're not growing your network from imprisonment. So I can't tell you, it was Michael shining a light on my early months in prison and essentially saying to me, you can continue to go down this path, that's your choice, but let me help you understand what happens on the other side. And that was the aha moment for me. And then there was a total pivot the next day. And that pivot included working alongside him 14 hours a day, scaling back my exercise routine from 6 hours a day to 2, trying to maintain exercise and dosages I knew I can maintain when I went home. I mean, you'll see this with guys you serve time. People go to prison, they may lose 100 pounds, 99% of them put it back on and then some, because you can't walk the track for 10 hours a day when you come home from prison. You have a job. So it was Michael Santos who began to get me on this track. And then I was obsessive, man. I was all in. And that's what made my transition so much easier. And that's why your transition will be so much easier, because you were all in, and that's sort of what it takes.
You're right. I mean, it is that choice, right? It does come down to a decision, and I'm going to make this work. But the one thing that, I face myself, and I don't hear a lot of people talk about, but, when you go through something like this, it just destroys your ego. It destroys your sense of identity, right? But who I am today, or who I see myself as, is completely different than who I saw myself as the minute before my indictment came down, right? And so how has, that affected you? And, maybe give a few tips or ideas on how you were able to kind of overcome that, that just complete destruction of your self-confidence.
So I wish I had had this conversation when I got into trouble, because my ego, when I got into trouble, the reason I lied to the government and I lied to lawyers is because of that ego. I wanted to hold on who I once was.
Yeah.
So I would tell my lawyers, well, I'm a former baseball player from USC and I had 600 clients. They all loved me. It was a bad decision I made on behalf of one, and I didn't have bad intentions when I began working with this person. It was UBS. Yeah, so it was that ego that precluded me from stepping back and thinking to myself, you have failed miserably. You've embarrassed and hurt people. You continue to fixate on yourself rather than the victims you've created. And I wish someone could throw a right punch or drop a bucket of cold ice on my head and help me understand how these actions would impact the rest of my life. So what changed for me in prison working alongside Michael is when I stopped identifying as a law-abiding citizen, because for a while I was not. When I stopped holding on to like the Bruce Springsteen song, the glory days, when I stopped talking about the fact that, I was once a student athlete, 20, nobody cares. What are you doing today? What are you doing to prepare? And the reason it's easier to talk about the glory days, again, it doesn't require any work. You can sit in the TV room or the chow hall and reflect on who we once were, the people we knew, right? The cars we drove, the watches we held or wore, rather than actually beginning to do the work. So the ego is what compelled me to continue to lie and cheat when I got into trouble. And then once you sort of start over and you recognize, wow, how much you've lost, there's a sense of freedom in that, because then it then forces you to try and do new things, right? Like I'm an introvert at heart. I do videos. I like something. I'm an introvert. I'm quiet. I'm not terribly communicative, but I'm a speaker and I travel and I talk on these subjects. I was forced to do things that were uncomfortable. And that all started from the inside of a federal prison and letting go of that ego and humbling myself to say, I'm going to have to do things I've never done before. And it's hard. It's hard work.
And so your confidence, I guess, from taking those little steps in the beginning, they begin to compound, right? And so is that how you were able to kind of rebuild your confidence and
I'll
kind
tell you
of
the confidence came because I am influenced by what other people think. And there are some people who are not, nothing could influence them what other people think. And I have friends like that. But I was beginning to develop confidence when Michael and I were working on our blog from prison. And my family and friends would say, dude, like, don't write this. You're writing about prison. Like, just forget about this experience. You're going to come home and it's going to be behind you. You're smart. You went to USC. Someone's going to hire you. And I'm like, I don't want a gift. I don't want a favor. I think they had good intentions in giving that advice, but they didn't understand you're learning this every day. As a convicted felon, you've got to approach things differently. I share this book, David and Goliath, written by Malcolm Gladwell, that essentially said to win as an underdog, you have to think differently. And I began to think, okay, well, I'm an underdog now for the first time in my life because I had so many breaks. So because I was this underdog, it required me to look at things differently. And I was writing openly and honestly about my crime. Right. And that's when forced some people to say, dude, don't do that. But I developed the confidence by continuing to power through, because in the past I may have stopped. I didn't want to disrupt the crowd. I didn't want to go against the grain or the flow, sort of a groupthink mentality. That's part of what got me into trouble. Everyone said it was okay. I'm like, okay, it's okay. Even though I knew that it was wrong, I didn't want to stand out.
Sure.
So it really changed for me when I began to get feedback like, dude, you're crazy. I'm begging you to stop. This is really harmful. You're going to regret this. And I'm thinking, this is the right path for me. I'm going to continue. That's when the confidence came. And of course, 13 years later, they're like, oh, it's the greatest idea ever. Yeah. We always supported you, which they did, but they still called me crazy.
Right. And so it's almost like through this path of creative destruction, right? Your identity is destroyed, and you then have to recreate a new identity out of pure necessity, right? And as you get going, you begin to build that momentum. And this is something that I've noticed as I've been trying to rebuild myself. In a world the world that I come from is as just like you, is a very kind of cutthroat, unforgiving world. Right. And you have to kind of be willing to take that first step, however scary it might be. Right. And then it begins to compound. And I think, I'm sort of at the beginning of my journey, but I've watched you and your growth, and now you make it look easy. It may still be difficult for you, but you don't show it.
Well, if I may, I wouldn't even say it's the beginning of the journey for you. And I speak of you often. So 2 days ago, I got a call from a defendant, and I know the lawyer. I like the lawyer. It's a $1,500 an hour lawyer. Very impressive. But I spoke with the defendant and I said, there are some things we actually still got a target letter from the SEC, but it's obvious it's going to become criminal. It's inevitable. It's in the Southern District of New York. It's a large loss amount. And I said, these are some things you should begin to do. And he said, yeah, my lawyer said it's too early. And I think the lawyer's probably giving him the advice that he thinks is correct. But you and I had the same conversation when you reached out to our team. You had good lawyers. Yeah. I liked them, but they were sort of like, it's too early. And I recall saying it wasn't too early to get indicted or give a $250,000 retainer to a law firm, or to have Department of Justice press releases castigating you as a criminal. It's not too early for banks to fire you, yet it's too early to begin mitigating for the possibility that you're going to get sentenced to prison and all of the collateral consequences. To your credit, you said, it's not too early. If anything, I wish I started sooner. Let's get going. So you didn't start then. You then began to do work of writing a manuscript. You know how hard that is? Everyone says they're going to do it. Like when I was in prison, Michael Santos taught a class and he said, everyone raise your hand if you want to write a book. Everyone's hand went up. How many did it? No hands went up. Yeah. Like you actually did it. So you're gaining this traction now by virtue of work you did when we met at the Grove in Hollywood 2 years ago. And you said, you flew out from Philly to see me, and you said, yeah, I'm all freaking in and I'm willing to do the work and hold people accountable. So that's why your transition will be easier compared to the dude that's like, well, I'm just going to wait and see what happens. It's usually not the best strategy. So I commend you for actually doing the work, and you're not afraid to hold people accountable, including me, but that'll be a different podcast.
Well, it's funny you pointed that out. I mean, this is not about me at the moment, but like my biggest regret, like you just pointed out, was I wish that I called you sooner. Right. And I think that a lot of people, and this is not just a prison experience, this is a failure experience, right? If you are experiencing a meaningful failure in life, whatever that might mean, it's easy to kind of sit and sulk, right? Mm-hmm. It's difficult to reach out for help, right? And I think that I use that as an excuse. Oh, well, maybe it's a little too early. Maybe this, maybe that. You're just putting up barriers to moving forward is all you're doing. You're creating artificial barriers. And so, that's one of the things that I think that I've had to overcome, even back then, and I still deal with this every single day as I'm trying to sit down and write my second book. I find myself, I should probably go get something to drink first, or I should put my shoes on. Like you find like these silly things.
There's that great Seinfeld episode where they're getting ready to write a pilot and they end up falling asleep for. So we're like, what do you have? I have nothing. There's 2 lines there. We'll deal with it tomorrow. Let's go get a sandwich.
Exactly.
That's why like having a mentor like Michael is so key, but something that you did well, I know it's not about you, you're discussing me. You embraced the idea. And I remember discussing this with you. I'm like, dude, you may work on something or anyone watching or listening, you may work on something today and think, no one will ever read this. Nobody will ever care. What am I doing? This is so much effort and time. Yet to do it anyway, to continue to push through is very fulfilling and very rewarding, because there are those days where you're like, none of this matters. And also it's not exactly fun to prepare for sentencing or prison, to ask someone in your network to write a character reference letter or humbly work on a statement for the judge. It's embarrassing. It's hard. It's requiring us to introspect and deal with failures. But if the goal is, success and a better outcome and keeping your family connected and growing your network so you can secure employment or raise funding, because banks aren't going to give you any money as a felon, especially if you owe money, you kind of think to yourself, well, I'm willing to do it. But it is hard, and it's part of the reason some guys say, well, I'm not going to do it because it doesn't matter anyway. Of course, that's the rationalization. They never get started. So it's just starting, but I needed a push. I frankly needed a punch. But once I had the punch, man, I never stopped. I never looked back.
Well, and so I think that's kind of like an interesting transition. We've hit on some things in my next question, which is like, to kind of the person experiencing that deep failure. It is easy to kind of, stay in your warm bed and kind of hang out and do absolutely nothing. Right. But, what advice do you give someone who's kind of in the pit, right? They're in it. They haven't reached out to anyone. They're just sort of in it and not progressing and probably getting worse. Is there any kind of, piece of advice or a few points that you might give somebody who's in that moment right now?
Several thoughts. Pay attention to the people you associate with. I wasn't truthful with people, so they told me what I wanted to hear. Justin, you'll never go to prison. You're a good guy. You're selling real estate. So associate with people who know the facts and you're willing to take criticism and feedback. Put that ego aside, because many of those people have your best interest. Though I know it can be tough to hear, and those who say they aren't swayed by criticism are probably swayed by criticism. I still am, but you need people to tell you the truth. You need to recognize that there are people who have been through worse struggles. You think about, you say staying in bed, you talk about the Stoics and Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius says, as a man, you can lay in bed under the warm covers and pillow, or you can get out of bed, you can get to work. So what guided me was a sense of perspective that like others have been through worse. So that's why Michael Santos is a mentor. I used to ask him in prison, like, well, he would get up at 1 a.m. and he would write all day and then run and connect with Carol, his wife, who he married in prison. I said, how do you do it? Like, what if it doesn't matter? And he'd say, well, it does matter. It matters to me. And I'm pursuing my values. And that was, so for those watching, there are people who have been through worse. I would learn from those struggles as a Jew. Michael introduced me to Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And I struggled to read the book. It's kind of dense. And he helped like translate parts of it for me. And one time in prison, he said, he's finding meaning in the blue sunset, despite his family summarily getting executed. And so it's so inspiring. If he can do it, maybe I can do it an easily year in a minimum security camp. So having people tell you the truth, but also recognizing there are people who have been through worse and learning from them, and then finding out how they got back on track. What was that plan? And it usually came down to something that Michael helped me understand, which was like, what is the next right thing to do? Before I turn it over to your next question, it's very easy while going through struggle to think of everything you have to do. So practically speaking, as a convicted felon, it's, wow, I have to get out of prison successfully. I have to rebuild my reputation. I have to repay my restitution. I have to make amends to my victims. I have to learn how to tell a girl over a cup of coffee that I got out of prison. I want to make money again. I have to do it without a license. It's so overwhelming. And part of you is like, man, there's no chance. I'm not even going to start. There's too much. So what helped me, and I hope help people who are listening or watching, is like, what is the next right thing to do? And for some, it could just be getting out of bed, shaving, going for a walk, and then doing it again. And that's what began Michael used to say, what's going to be different a week from now? What's going to be different in a week? And then sometimes that was too big for me. And he said, okay, what's going to be different 24 hours from now? Then we can begin to measure it. And actually in my office is my prison diary right behind me. And I used to right there in the middle there. And I used to measure some of these things. And only then by measuring it, could you get away from happy talk and actually getting into what I actually do. And then you realize when you write it down, how much time we actually do waste, how much time we invest in things that are just pointless and a waste of time. So forgive me for going on and on. It really starts with what is the next right thing to do? Yeah. Only then can you gain traction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an important point. I was actually writing about that yesterday in my manuscript that I'm working on. Is just do something really small, right? It's all about building that momentum. And I found for me, one of the things that I went into prison and I was trying to work on, I'm not trying to sidetrack here, but it's a really good point. I always wanted to be a morning person. I've never been able to wake up early my whole life. I wake up at 5 a.m. every day now, right? And how did I do that? When I was in prison, I would set my watch for, I started at like 6:45, right? Like I started really late. And I would set it for 15 minutes earlier. And then slowly over time, eventually I would just kind of get up as the sun was coming up and then even earlier. And today I get up every day around, 4:45, 5 o'clock. And so it's all about taking those little steps, but that's been over a year in the making, right? And the second point that you made is something that I need to do a better job of. And I'm really glad that you mentioned this, is measuring, kind of keeping track of your progress. Right. Because I think if I was to sit down and write all of the positive changes in my life that I've made, I think I would be blown away. Right. I'm in the best shape of my life. I'm on my second book. I'm working on this podcast, among many other things. But I've made so much progress. I've continued to invest in positive relationships, but I don't reflect on it enough. Could you talk a little bit about, reflecting on your progress and the importance of kind of tracking these things?
So our nonprofit Prison Professors Charitable Corporation, we teach in prisons and jails all across the country. So 100,000 people in California prisons go through the Straight A Guide program that Michael created. And one of the A's in the Straight A Guide is appreciation. Even if you're going through struggle, if you're in a prison or jail or with struggles that we may have been through, there are things you can appreciate along the way, because if you don't find those little things to appreciate, then it's easy to just continue to ruminate or obsess or fixate on overall all the things that are going wrong. So the things to appreciate or show gratitude for can be very small. If it's waking earlier, in my case, it started with sending some letters to people that I had hurt, knowing that I may not hear back from them as a consequence of going to prison. Some relationships just end. And people are going to judge you. Some people will take pleasure in your conviction, pleasure in the pain, especially if they were jealous of success that you have had. So that's how this works at times. So for me, the appreciation started with sending letters. Thank you for standing by me. Thank you for continuing to support me. I didn't get some letters back, but without that appreciation, you're just going to remain in a kind of a constant state of misery. And you speak of measurements. Just measuring small things, whether it's waking early or getting out of bed earlier, or running and walking and eating healthier. I'll tell you, I think that the trick to managing struggle is finding some benefits from it. If not, I'll tell you, man, it's a totally wasted experience. I mean, then it is like, holy good God, it would be like, it's just wasted. So I derive some sort of pleasure. And that's why for some guys, it's a life sentence. It's like, we still get those calls. Yes. I've been home for 10 years, Justin. I only served a year and a day at a federal prison camp, but I can't get a job and I'm depressed and I'm angry, and I empathize with that. But in many ways, based on their adjustment in prison and after, and being fearful to try new things, in many ways, it's a life sentence. And I didn't want that for me, man. No. They got their 18 months, no more. They got your 10 months or whatever long you served, no more. That was plenty. Yeah, I challenge myself.
I think that's beautiful. It really is about challenging yourself, but also taking that time to be proud of yourself, right? For those little steps that you've made, and that's something I certainly.
Quick thing, proud of myself, like working in the kitchen. There are people who will listen to this and think, "Wow, this guy's an egotistical, arrogant, stuck up." Yeah, I was before I went to prison. Let me be very clear. And I can tell you the hardest job I've ever had isn't writing or consulting. It was actually working in the kitchen for many hours, which for some people would be nothing, I know. But for me, that was like real work for the first time in my life. And I came to appreciate and look forward to the work because I had ample opportunities to get out of the job, because in prison, guys will say, pay me, I'll do your job. It's fine. So I'm going to do my job. I want to contribute. And there are days where I'll look back and think, that was difficult. That was difficult for me. So it's learning to appreciate it rather than view it as a curse or as a sentence. There are a lot of things I came to enjoy.
Well, and also
even running out of commissary. Like one of them, like one time I ran out of commissary with 10 days left. I'm like, God, this is an opportunity for me to struggle through having to eat in the chow hall.
Right.
I'm out of food. It's, this is a good thing. I just tried to find the benefit in like everything rather than like, oh my God, I'm out of commissary or phone minutes. Like, what do I do? This is awful. I'm like, I kind of embrace it. We can't control it. It's done. Those things are what can make the experience more fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. You're out of peanut butter and darn, it's the worst. I know that feeling. But anyway, all right. So kind of like the theme of this is really about kind of like understanding failure and trying to turn it into something. Just like you have created, so much, and you've helped so many people. Your story is just amazing to me. But for somebody who's, kind of in the midst of failure right now, do you believe that that pain is required for wisdom, or can someone learn wisdom through the lessons that you and I have gone through? Right. I'm not sure that there's a right or wrong answer to this question.
There's got to be, I think there's got to be some pain. And for me, I mean, I think like when I do cardio, you could walk. I really feel pain if I try to run fast. That's when it's working. It's kind of like I've earned this. I've earned this pain. It's painful to wake at 5 a.m. if you're used to getting up at 7. Yeah. It's painful to sit and write for 6 hours when you'd rather watch TV or do something different. It's painful to write a letter to your network, apologize. And it's painful to cold walk, which is what I did when I got out of prison, peddling my book, Lessons from Prison. So, reading a book is very easy. It's somewhat passive. The hard part, the painful part, is implementing lessons learned. At least for me, like the pain of the pain and looking back to what life was like before I made the change is really what compelled me to wake up and work hard and do things differently. So people may be able to read a book or learn a lesson and watch a podcast and make changes without pain. Not for me. I look at changes that I want to implement in my life, and they're hard, or to use your word, they're painful. Maybe not physically, but just mentally, because we're creatures of habit, and it's hard. It's just really hard to change. I think it was Dostoevsky that said, usually the second half of a man's life is just a repeat of the first half of the first part of their life. It's just, we're so deep and entrenched in what we do. It really requires introspection and resolve and pain, I think, to make changes. And part of the reason so people are averse to doing it, including me, still parts of my life, is because it's hard and it's painful. Yeah, you got to have some pain, I think.
So I forget who said this, but every day when I sit down to write, I feel like an armless, legless man with a crayon in my mouth. I forget who said that, but that's how it feels in many ways. When you're beginning to rebuild, writing is just one example of that. All right. And so, before my final question, anybody who's interested in finding you and kind of learning a little bit more about you, maybe you could kind of give your Instagram, your Twitter. I'm not sure what you have, but I think that would be helpful.
whitecollaradvice.com. Our team produces tons of free content around the criminal justice system, preparing for sentencing. Success in life, though admittedly the focus is more on the criminal justice system, emerging successfully with a conviction. And Instagram, Justin Paperny, though not terribly active online nor on Twitter. It's more YouTube, where our team produces a lot of content on the White Collar Advice YouTube channel, the Prison Professor YouTube channel, and we provide commentary and a perspective that can only come from having served time in prison. Everyone on our team has been through the criminal justice system, and we approach it from a slightly different perspective. But what we don't do is prey on the vulnerabilities of people and waste time on things that are utterly useless, like should I buy avocados or apples in the chow hall or in the commissary? It comes down to the question that Michael Santos asked me 3 months into my federal prison term. what do you want the rest of your life to look like? And what are you doing today to make that happen? And when I didn't have an answer, it was troubling to me. And we want to help people answer that before it's never too late, but before they call us when they're home from prison, like, wow, I'm home. What do I do? No one will hire me. Then you can look back and retrace what they've done, and they all end up saying the same thing. Yeah. I wish I started sooner. I had that mentor and guide in prison with Michael. I'm really an ambassador for what he created through 26 years in prison. It's my privilege to share the body of work that he's created and help grow it together. But specifically, it's ensuring and helping people not let this become a life sentence. And we take a lot of pleasure in doing that.
That's wonderful. And you know, I can speak to personal experience having worked with you guys. You guys are just, you completely changed the way I viewed this whole thing. And I like to think that, you know, this podcast probably wouldn't have existed if I hadn't, you know, taken the time to meet you and to meet Michael and to work with you guys. And so, all right. So final question. So if you had to distill it down to one thing, one kind of key takeaway point, what was the most valuable lesson that you've learned from, you know, the catastrophic failure that you've had in your life?
The biggest lesson I learned was people have been through worse. People have overcome struggle, and I wanted to learn from them, and I modeled them. Right? Michael likes to use the Steve Jobs quote: "Good leaders take ideas, and great leaders steal ideas." I stole from what other people like Michael Santos or Viktor Frankl or Sean Hopwood or a number of that was very inspiring to me. And at the bottom, I used to say, if they could do it, so can I. I mean, that's just sort of, I would say that repeatedly. If Michael could run 10 miles, so can I. If Michael can do this, and a lot of times I didn't do it as well, but simply by trying. So I'm competitive. I think I'm smart enough. I'm good enough, to use that old Al Franken SNL quote. You know, I'm good enough. I'm smart enough. I can do it. I used to tell myself, if they did it through much harder circumstances, so can I. And it's really that simple. And that compelled me to wake early when the dorm was sleeping and to ingrain some new habits. And they were freaking hard, and they're still hard. And sometimes I still want to revert back to them, but I know the consequences that follow if I do, of sleeping in, of becoming lazy, of eating poorly, of not exercising, of not managing a work-life balance, all things that are really, really, really hard. Right. And I'm not always perfect, and I fail a lot. But to answer your question, others have been through it. Figure if they did it, you know, so can I.
That's it. Everybody's human, right? And so if there is someone, if there's another human being that did it, chances are you can too, or you could get damn near close to it, right? And I think that's what you're saying, right? The hardest part is getting started.
The next right, like Michael, what's the next right thing to do? Forget about the reputation and the career and the money and the book and the brand and the network and probation. Am I going to travel again? And what's going to happen? Like what the next 15 minutes, what could be the next right thing to do? Last thing I'll say, like as a runner, I use the Strava app, and I have our team has a new client who's 100 pounds overweight, been struggling to get out of bed. And he said, what's the next right thing to do? I said, go register on Strava, go walk a mile. And when you do, I'm a follow of yours, I'm going to upload it. So now he's walking 4 days a week. It's gone from a mile to 2 miles to 2.5 miles, you know, and he's waking earlier. I want to have more energy. I'm eating better. I'm drinking more water. It was, what's the next right thing to do? I said, just register on don't even walk today. Just go register and create a profile. Then the next right thing to do tomorrow will be to walk a mile. So that's the best advice. Like what's the next right thing in the next 5 minutes, 3 minutes? You know, that's what began to work for me.
Absolutely. I think that's incredible advice. And so, all right, Justin, well, look, I won't keep you much longer. Thank you so much for doing this. You know, I've got so many pearls of wisdom out of this, and I think everybody who's watching it's going to get the same. And so from the bottom of my heart, thank you.
I admire you, man. You did the work, dude. I get chills now. I'll never forget our meeting at Wood Ranch, having lunch at the Grove in West Hollywood. And I remember telling Michael when the meeting was over, I'm like, you know, he's different. He's willing to do the work. He flew out here. He's determined. He's committed. I said, he's successful. So I'll never forget it, man. You're incredible.
I just remember you
did the work.
I just remember crying the whole time and you not laughing at me. So that was like the best part.
I really love what you're doing. It'll be my privilege to try to refer others who have gone through even much harder struggles and stresses than me to participate. And I really admire you. Michael has got to come on soon because there's no one like Michael Santos. Good Lord, you got to get him on. I'm just really grateful.
He's a monster. I'll be able to get him, his attention for more than 5 minutes eventually. It'll happen. Yeah.
Congratulations on the podcast. I look forward to sharing it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Justin.
Okay.
All right, man.
I thought that was great.
Yeah, me